The theme of today's discussion encompasses labour market changes, skills and education, unemployment and institutional reform. Our panellists are Jason Beckfield from Harvard, Bob Breunig from the Crawford School, Dan Finn from Portsmouth, Mark Cully from Industry Innovation, Science Research and Tertiary Education. I bet you guys call that ICET, do you? Just shot in the dark. And our events will be kicked off by Sandra Parker from Education, Employment and Workplace Relations, and Sandra will begin, and then the panel will respond, and then we'll open the floor. Sandra, thanks.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm very pleased to be here. I thought I would talk about structural change and what that means for the labour market in Australia. I thought that would be a good discussion starter for people in the context of the broader topics that you've been looking at today. So, to kick right off, we've had, as people would be well aware, I'm sure, the Australian economy has had a history of structural change, regularly seeing jobs created at the same time as we've had job losses occurring. Unfortunately, the media focuses on the losses rather than the creation quite often. That comes about as industries transition to new markets, new technologies come out, and as businesses adapt to a low carbon environment, or as consumer preferences change. We've also had the rapid rise of Asia, increased global competition, the high Australian dollar. All of those are placing pressure on some industries, and of course some are finding it harder to remain competitive. This restructuring can also have a significant impact on local labour markets, on productivity and employment. But on the other hand, it can create access to new markets and provide new opportunities for jobs. So just some stats around that. The last 25 years have been marked by some fundamental structural changes in the industry composition of employment in Australia. In particular, we've seen an overall decline in employment in the traditionally large employing industries of manufacturing, while we've seen strong growth in areas like healthcare, social assistance, professional, scientific and technical services, education and training. Healthcare and social assistance has gone from being the third largest employing industry to the largest, and it employs over 1.3 million people. Of course, manufacturing is not in significant decline. It's still one of the largest employers. It employs nearly 1 million people. It ranks fourth behind health, retail and construction, and it's going to continue to be a huge employer. But Australia has, and so Australia is modern, it's sophisticated, it's diverse, it has industries that are continually changing. We can and should expect this to continue, and we should see this positively. So the labour market outlook in the near term, as people would be aware, is subdued or soft. The predictions are solid employment growth to return over the next 5 years. Employment is in fact projected to grow by 829,300 nationally over the 5 years from 11-12 to 16-17. And the trend toward higher skills, service-based jobs is projected to continue over the period. So in line with past trends, our department projects the major service industries to contribute substantially to employment growth over the next 5 years. So healthcare, social assistance, construction in an expected return to stronger growth in that industry, and professional, scientific and technical and education and training, as I mentioned before. And the proportion of workers employed in manufacturing, agriculture, forestry and fishing is projected to continue to decline over that period. So the challenge, of course, for policy makers and businesses and the community is to create conditions and capabilities for Australian businesses to continue to succeed. So that means flexibility, and it means ability for workers to move to new jobs and to train and skill for new jobs. The role of government is to support the most disadvantaged job seekers and those who have the hardest time in re-engaging with the labour market after job losses without impeding economic growth. In terms of the government support specifically, for job seekers who are on income support, the government invests around $10 billion over a 4-year cycle, and that's through programs such as Job Services Australia, through Disability Employment Services and our new Remote Jobs and Communities program starting mid-year. So Job Services Australia and our Disability Employment Services program are around $8.7 billion. And JSA and DES have placed around 1.45 million people in work since it commenced, so since 2009 with the new programs. And of course, job seekers in those programs range from those who are considered to be job ready, just need a bit of assistance to get them on the road to a job, and those who require significant intensive assistance to get them ready for work. So job seekers who have participation requirements that go along with their income support have to undertake specific activities aimed at getting them job ready and into work. And those things, the support plus the actual requirements are what encourages people to take up and keep jobs. So there's been about $15.6 billion invested in vocational education and training, as well as $3 billion for a package called Building Australia's Future Workforce, which started in 2011, has 39 measures that are around productivity, skills development and place-based measures. So areas where there's greatest needs, large investment, looking at pulling a whole range of services together and testing out quite different service delivery arrangements in those areas. And I mentioned from 1 July 2013, our Remote Jobs and Communities programs will operate in 59 remote regions, and they are taking a place-based and integrated service approach to help people with barriers to participate and get jobs. So a different approach being tested there. In terms of what we call displaced workers, the government does support displaced workers to improve their job searching skills and their access to job opportunities. So when restructure happens in a company or in an industry, some redundant workers will obviously move into new jobs quite quickly, and they need very little assistance, and the government provides minimal assistance. Redundant workers in shrinking industries or areas where it is difficult to find jobs can struggle to compete in new jobs in a modern labour market. So older workers who lose their jobs, unskilled workers, these groups often experience re-employment difficulty, and they can suffer quite large earning losses following a redundancy. The government's primary vehicle for providing assistance to these workers is Job Services Australia, and the support there includes things like resume preparation, job applications, interview skills, career advice, and funding for training and reskilling. The government also has structural adjustment programs, and that's in areas where workers lose their jobs and new opportunities are scarce, and where we see large-scale closures that are going to disrupt local labour markets. So the government provides additional support, for example, for redundant workers in automotive, in textile manufacturing industries, workers from BlueScope Steel, and its suppliers in the Illawarra and Western Port areas. So these programs get extra support through JSA. Government considers these on a case-by-case basis. And I've mentioned before, it's getting that balance right is tricky between providing enough support that people will get back on and reskill and get jobs, and the sort of rescuing and propping, which can be the other side of the coin. So it is a balancing act for any government. There's also regional support. So, sometimes there's firm closures and sometimes it's actually whole regions that are impacted. And where an area is already experiencing labour market disadvantage, the government does provide some assistance. So obviously the degree to which these regions are affected will depend on things like where they are, what sort of industries they have, whether they're trade exposed, given the high dollar, the demographic and skills profile, their past performance economically, and access to population centres, infrastructure and transport. So the government considers the capacity of the regions, and it looks to absorb the impact of adjustment where they believe that it meets particular criteria. So example of that is in response to the global financial crisis, the government established what they called 20 priority employment areas, and they were designed to put very quick assistance into areas that were seen as already suffering and were likely to continue to suffer on a whole range of factors. So unemployment, ability, all the things I mentioned before. So 20 of those vary considerably. Some are very large in terms of geography, some are smaller, and some have different characteristics. I have to say, nearly the whole of Tasmania, for example, is covered under this, so it does vary a bit. And in each of those, we have local employment coordinators who work in those areas to drive local responses, to try and get all the players together, to try to facilitate, where possible, job creation, matching, trying to get the services working effectively in a very targeted way. They work with all levels of government to try and get those local solutions happening. We also have 34 regional education, skills and jobs coordinators who work in parallel, very focused on skills and plans to reskill people across a broader range of areas. So I mentioned before the government's role can be tricky, has to be carefully considered and nuanced, so the balance is right, and it's not always easy to do that. So I mentioned before that it's about those who are most affected by the structural change when that occurs, and that it has to be aimed at facilitating and not stopping change. So as I said, the propping issue can actually stop necessary change, and it needs to allow resources to move to where they can be most effectively used and where they can most assist individuals to take advantage of new opportunities. So employment measures include participation-oriented employment programs, so getting people doing things, getting them trained, getting them ready for work, recognising experience and skills that workers already have and how that might assist them to adjust quickly to new areas and new roles. It needs to have flexible and responsive training support, and of course counselling and mentoring, responding to workers' needs and helping them move to the next the new transition, new opportunities. So the focus should be on skills and productivity, quick activation and connection to the labour market. As you would all know, the longer people are away from the labour market, the more difficult it is for them to then reconnect. But it's also about providing a strong social safety net so people know that they are going to be supported for the time when they will be out of work, needing to adjust. And then there's also the need of the broader stakeholders, such as the employers, the communities, the infrastructure and innovation investment, the positive messaging that governments need to send so that communities don't sort of spiral when something negative happens. And of course, measures need to be very targeted. They need to play a complementary role to other programs that already exist. It's important they don't duplicate or confuse, and they need to be place-based where necessary, so that they're not one size fits all. So all of those things are pretty difficult. In terms of the income support system, that is there obviously to provide a safety net, and that is there while the person is unemployed. And it's that balance. It needs to achieve the right balance between encouraging someone to work and give them some security, but encourage them to realise that a job is actually a better answer, and that's what they're better off having. So there's the difficulty of workers who lose their job under a restructure not necessarily getting access to income support immediately because they'll have some assets, redundancy payments, etc. The government's taken account of that in changing this waiting period before they can get income support. So from 1 July, the assets allowed will be doubled and the waiting period shortened. And so that means newly unemployed Australians will be able to keep more of their savings while they look for work, and that of course provides comfort and security as well in that difficult time. There's also our safety net around workers' entitlements. For those who are aware, we have a fair entitlements guarantee. There's a scheme that provides a safety net if the employee is owed entitlements following an insolvency or bankruptcy. So there's a basic payment scheme that assists those employers who've lost those entitlements and who are owed certain amounts of money. And of course, for those who are unemployed for long periods of time, as we know, very difficult to get a foothold back in the labour market. More than half of people who go on to New Start get work in less than 12 months. That's good, demonstrate the services are working, but a growing number of job seekers are remaining unemployed for more than 12 months. They're becoming long-term unemployed and very long-term unemployed, which is 2 years or more out of work. And our ABS data shows there are around 122,100 individuals who are long-term unemployed and 54,100 very long-term unemployed in January this year. So these job seekers have lower unemployment and positive outcomes compared to other job seekers. Once they've become unemployed for 1 year, we know that more than half will become very long-term unemployed. And once they've been unemployed for 2 years, we know that more than 2/3, 68%, will go on to be unemployed for a further year. And a large and growing number of these very long-term unemployed people have significant barriers to employment. They have lack of education, health issues and disability. And they're much more likely to be Indigenous, homeless, aged over 50, ex-offenders or early school leavers. So it is incredibly important that the services are targeted right and they're provided to job seekers to give each one of them the best chance of finding employment. There's been a number of programs to support that group of people. I mentioned the Building Australia's Future Workforce package. I mentioned that balance before. The government's introduced tougher obligations, tougher participation requirements. So after 12 months in what we call our work experience phase, or 24 months of being unemployed and in employment services, job seekers will be required to have 11 months in every 12 of activity, of work experience or other training or other activities. And there's funding that goes with that. The view is to keep people activated, keep them working, keep them positive, keep them developing so that they have the best chance of getting a job. We also have other successful programs such as the positive side, wage subsidies for employers, that are proving incredibly successful. And there's 35,000 places available. They've been oversubscribed. Employers are responding incredibly well to those. To finish, we've got a new employment services program being developed from 2015. We're talking about what that should look like now. It's very important for us to look at what's worked in the past, but in terms of this conversation I've had before, or the discussion I've had before about the changing labour market, structural adjustment, that continuous change within Australia, that 2015 program has got to take account of that. It's got to be future focused. It's very important that it doesn't just look backwards. We need to think about what is Australia likely to look like in 2015 and the 5 years or 3 years of contracting that goes beyond that, and what is going to be the most flexible, most effective program that we can develop to work with those job seekers who really need help. So to conclude, Australia is in a very good position. We're in a much better position than most other advanced economies. In the face of global economic weakness and uncertainty, Australia has achieved a remarkable record on job creation, in stark contrast to millions of jobs lost around the world in recent years. So the number of Australians in full-time work remains at historically high levels. More Australians are in work than ever before in the country's history, with employment at a record high of 11.5 million. More than 926,000 jobs have been created since November 2007. The economy thrives when we have a strong workforce and profitable, innovative businesses. And as businesses and industries move to more sustainable ways of working, workers will need new skills. They'll need to increase their efficiency. They'll need to adapt to new technologies. They'll need to meet the demands of a more sustainable world, and so will the companies that employ them. So helping Australians meet those challenges will ensure that every Australian has the chance to work in more rewarding and high-skilled jobs now and in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandra. Mark.
Thanks, Bruce.
That was
Darth Vader-ish, wasn't
Disconcerting.
it? I think that some people pronounce the acronym DESERTE of the department, and if we just get to that TE bit that stands for Tertiary Education, I might kind of make a few remarks around that kind of fit in with Sandra's remarks. So at the end of every decade, the Reserve Bank holds a conference. It's been doing it, I think, for about 40 years now, over 4 decades, where they have a kind of review of the decade that's preceded it, and they always have a chapter. Somebody would do a paper on the labour market over the previous decade, and Jeff Borland did the last one in 2010, and he described the decade ending 2010 as a quiet decade. I was a bit puzzled by that kind of choice of a subtitle. It seemed to me that it was a tremendously eventful decade in the labour market, at least in terms of outcomes. A little bit like Sandra said, we had tremendous gains in employment growth, mostly, not exclusively, but mostly in skilled work. The employment to population ratio reached a record high. At the same time, the US was having very fast employment growth in the 90s and maybe eased off a bit in the 2000s. But the other feature of the Australian labour market in that decade was rising real incomes across the entire income distribution. Yes, it was higher at the top than it was at the bottom, but there were rising incomes across the distribution. And if you go back, there's a paper I was looking at not so long ago that was written by Bob Gregory, obviously well known from here, and Paul Freitas when he was based here about a decade ago. And they were mulling over the growth in the number of people on income support in Australia, people on disability support pensions, and withdrawal of older men from the workforce and so on. And they were trying to think about, well, why is this the case? And they were basically, their argument was that the wage distribution in Australia, reflecting the productivity of the workers, had become much more dispersed over the last period because of opening up of the Australian economy, because of what economists sometimes call skill bias, technical change, and because of the fracturing of some of the institutions which had underpinned the Australian economy in the 20th century, tariffs, award system, and so on. And they said, well, we're actually looking at probably a pretty ugly number of years going forward. We're looking at a trajectory of reduced minimum wages, harsher access regimes for income support, more decentralised labour negotiations, changes in marginal taxation and benefit withdrawal rates. They speculated that there could be 20% of the population would never be able to have their skills increased above a current minimum wage standard, whatever educational intervention we apply. And then they finish on the optimistic side, it may well prove eminently possible to educate the next generation of Australians out of the current situation. And I think that the optimistic scenario is largely won the day in Australia. We've just been doing some work using the 2011 and 2001 censuses and breaking them up into a kind of quasi-cohort analysis. And what we've found is that for every one person retiring from the workforce with a degree, there were 8 people replaced them over the course of that decade, so leading to a net gain of 700,000 people with degrees. For every one person retiring with a vocational qualification, there were 4 people replacing them with a vocational qualification for a net gain of 600,000 people with those qualifications. And there were more than 300,000 people gained a postgraduate qualification in that period. And I think there, at least it's at least consistent with an argument that if you take Paul and Bob's starting point, that what's happened is we've shifted the distribution to the right and have led to a situation which has been largely a happy one of rising employment opportunities and rising real wages. Thanks.
Well, I don't. I guess there are just maybe 2 comments I would make, picking up from what Sandra has said. The first is that I think we need to be extremely concerned about those people who are in that long-term unemployed group, the long-term on benefit group.
And in particular, the group I'm concerned about is the children of those people. If someone's 55 and they can't work anymore because they're unable to find a job and they don't have particularly high skills, it's a small cost for society to pay for that person to stay on benefit until they get to the old age pension. And we saw this for those of you who were at Bob Gregory's talk last week, we saw that generally men over the age of 45 who move on to payments roughly stay on payments for the rest of their life. And they may not stay as very long-term unemployed, but they may move to the disabled pension, or they may move to some other pension before moving to the old age pension. That's a cost that society has to bear. Different societies are willing to bear that cost. I think it's one of the big, since this is a trans-Pacific dialogue, being from America originally, Australians have much less tolerance for inequality than Americans do, and that's perfectly reasonable. Different societies can decide how to trade off the costs and benefits. What I worry about is the children of those people. What we saw in the Youth in Focus study that I ran is that if we look at 18 to 20-year-olds who are in families and they spent more than a third of their life, so in more than a third of their first 18 years, their family was dependent on income support, we see extraordinarily bad outcomes for those 18 to 20-year-olds in terms of educational and employment activities relative to families that were not on income support. So to whatever degree we think that our education system should be equalizing opportunities among young people, we find that it fails to do that. And it fails to do that because disadvantage is multidimensional, and it fails to do that because children who grow up in households that aren't working don't necessarily learn the values of hard work and don't necessarily see why they should be working hard. I don't think it's just a value story, but the fact of the statistic remains. So we see 75% of 20-year-olds pursuing education. In families that weren't exposed to income support, we see 50% in families where the kids were on income support. So that's clearly a problem we need to address. The second thing I would say is that if we look around the world at the effect of training and reskilling, at what works and what doesn't work, one of the things that we find is that the group of people who respond the best to training and reskilling are often women who are coming back into the labor force after having children and who've got some higher education or who are educated. And so I think one of the things we lose track of in the debate when we talk about reskilling for 40 to 50-year-old men or pick whatever age group you want is that we're often dealing with a set of people whose basic education is very low. And so I want to know what we should be doing for people when they're 3 and 4 and 5 years old up to age 18 to improve their educational outcomes, so that even if they don't go get higher education, even if they go and get a job in the mining sector that essentially doesn't involve anything more than a high school education, when they lose their job at age 45, they've got a base of education that we can build upon for retraining and reskilling. So I think this debate can't be separated from what we're doing even at the National Quality Framework 3 to 5-year-old level, that just basic education needs to be improved, and we need to be viewing that basic education as a base for future training and reskilling. And the only other thing I would say is that I don't think, again, back to the Trans-Pacific dialogue, the US to this point has built a much better base of evidence around the effectiveness of its training programs. And they've essentially done that by making data available to academic researchers. I think that's something in Australia that we haven't gone far enough in. And I think we need to be much more creative in exploring ways that we can be doing evaluation of training programs in partnership with government and academia. Bruce? Dan?
Yeah, I'm the oddball from Europe and from England who's been asked to make a few comments, so it's not exactly trans-Pacific, and we are also in Europe in the eye of the storm in terms of austerity politics and the long impacts of the global financial crisis and things like that. The thing I want to focus on a little bit, which probably reflects my own kind of interests, is the institutional part of what the session was, the areas it was kind of exploring. One of the things is that what we know now is that the organisation, the institutional organisation of employment services on the one hand and delivery of services and the way we organise our benefit systems matter very much in the resilience of economies and the resilience of populations to deal with the kind of economic shocks that we, certainly in Europe, been living through, and certainly in the States, you've actually been living through. And what I would say in the, particularly in Northern and Western Europe, the key thing there has been to try to restructure those institutions and restructure those benefit systems in ways that combine strong social safety nets with work incentives and employment-focused welfare systems. It's maybe relatively easy to get people into contingent kinds of jobs when you actually say there's no money available for them, as I think the US is part of their kind of answer to the kind of problem. What we're trying to do is to kind of create systems that both increase the obligations on people on benefits, but actually keep that safety net there for people in the long term, especially for those populations and those groups who are going to struggle to exist in the kind of the new employment opportunities and new kinds of labour markets that are becoming available. The crucial thing about those institutions is without them you can't do the responses that Sandra was actually describing. You know, you need an institutional structure that's flexible enough and quick on its feet enough and nimble enough to be able to kind of respond in the way that I think Australia was able to the global financial crisis, albeit in a much more favourable set of circumstances than many other European countries. But what you find in European countries is I think that those countries that invested more in reforming their welfare systems and their public employment services in the 90s and the early 2000s showed a greater resilience in responding to the kind of problems that have come along and have actually been able to kind of, if not reduce unemployment, at least stop the increase being as rapid as it has been in some of the peripheral countries in Europe. So to me, the institutional question is really kind of important. A longer time question, and I think one that Australia is grappling with, I think the US to some extent is grappling with, and in Europe we are, is that given the kind of labour market, the hourglass economies that we've been describing, you know, lots of high-skilled, skill-based kind of technical advance and things like that, there are lots of casual, more flexible, part-time jobs also being created at the bottom end of the labour market. Now, the routes out of them are much more fragmented and much more difficult than in the future. And one of the questions for us is about, in the future, I think it's going to be about the combinations of work and welfare rather than welfare simply into work. And that combination of work and welfare will become even more acute as we extend active benefit systems to older workers, to workers who've got health conditions and disabilities, and to people who've got caring kind of responsibilities. And I think that is a crucial kind of difference and one that we're all kind of grappling with at the moment. So those are the things I just wanted to add to the debate.
Jason?
Thanks, Bruce. Quite a lot of interesting topics on the table for discussion, I think. I mean, and I think I have more to learn from the discussion than I have to necessarily offer ideas on it. But I'll mention 4 things that have come to mind in listening to the other panelists. One is the issue of conflict. The second is an issue around targeting. The third is an issue about children. And the fourth is an issue about data. And so as you can tell, there's not like a linear connection between these 4 different points, right? Around conflict, it's striking how much of the conversation today has been really bloodless. Unless I'm completely missing some major axis of division in Australian society that everyone else knows about and has been referred to directly, and it's just gone over my head, which is not outside the realm of possibility, right? I wouldn't want to exclude that. But when we're talking about labor markets and income distribution, it's really hard not to bring up the issue of conflict and power, and I'm wondering how folks see the politics of that moving forward, or maybe it's just not a polite thing for public servants to discuss in public. You know, this could be another explanation for why I'm not hearing it. The second issue is actually related. It's an issue of the politics of targeted social policy. I worry a little bit about, you know, this is certainly something that happens in the U.S. context. I mean, one of the risks of a very carefully targeted policy arrangement is that, you know, moving forward, that has a tendency of delimiting the kinds of political coalitions that can be built to support that kind of policy, you know, moving forward, right? So it, you know, it can kind of become a victim of its own success in a way. About children, one of the really interesting areas of policy debate in the U.S. now, I think, is around education for very young children, you know, early childhood education, talking about you know, infancy through 3 years of age. And it seems like if the question is kind of how do you build a very firm basis for human capital formation and productivity and flexibility, you know, over time at a very individual, personal level. That seems to be a real opportunity for developing those kinds of capacities if you really look to the foundations of where those things emerge. And then on data, you know, you mentioned you know, the promise of potentially looking at you know, data on a lot of these employment programs to see, you know, what seems to work, what doesn't work, the trajectories of people over time, questions like that. I'm not exactly familiar with the barriers to that data sharing that you're getting at, but I just want to offer, you know, one plug for, I think, an innovative program for making individual level data accessible to the research community in a way that overcomes a lot of the privacy considerations. And again, I don't know, you know, to what extent those are really the foundation of the barriers, right? But maybe this mechanism is one way of getting around whatever barriers exist. The Luxembourg income study, you know, is a very, very clever, I think, mechanism for, you know, remote analysis of, you know, highly detailed and really very sensitive individual level data. You know, so that I'm wondering if that would just be one little mechanism that could potentially help.
Before I open the floor, as our speakers were speaking, I jotted down some notes on US labour market trends over the last 20 or 30 years, and this may be sort of old hat for the room, but I thought I would get these empirics on the table before we open the discussion up. And these were some notes I was making as people were speaking. Increased job polarisation, so proliferation of employment at the top and the bottom of the income distribution. David Order's done some great work on that. Income stagnation in the lower half of the distribution, so US incomes have grown very slowly. US earnings have grown very slowly in the bottom half of the earnings distribution. Increased earnings volatility, so the year-to-year fluctuations in earnings is much higher now than it was in, say, the 1970s. Declining job tenure in the United States, so very long-term, for recent cohorts of workers, very long-term job tenure has significantly disappeared from the US labour market, so very long-term employment relationships are becoming much more uncommon. The proliferation of bad jobs, Arnie Kallenberger has written about this, so this is a proliferation of jobs without medical insurance or other kinds of benefits, vacation pay and so on. Incomes have become increasingly detached from productivity growth. So through the period of productivity growth since the 90s, say, incomes have not kept pace with productivity growth, and so Peter Temin and Frank Levy have written about this. Significant decline in unionisation, which of course we also see in Australia, and in the US that's associated with about a third of the growth in private sector wage inequality among men is associated with declining unionisation. In the recession, very unusual for the US. About half of the employment now in the period of the recession is long-term unemployment, which is very unusual for the US labour market. There was virtually no long-term employment historically in the US labour market. Now there's a ton. Increasing rates of disability and declining rates of labour force participation among older men, older working age men. And so programs in the United States like supplemental security income and SSDI have become an important income replacement scheme for men in their 50s and so on who are permanently exiting the labour market. So the US landscape is utterly different, I think, from the Australian, which is a great puzzle for us to get our teeth into as well. So with that, let me open the floor to your questions. And if you don't have questions, I have questions of the panel, so yes.
Peter Atkins from the Major Cities Unit, the Australian Government. Running across some of the themes earlier today on the question of poverty and inequality as the flip side, dark story of productivity. One of the things we do share in common with the US in the way in which restructured labour forces have manifested in new forms of city, such that people are locating in the inner urban areas, the highly educated particularly, that we're getting a social stratification of the city around the labour markets, and that's a very important common phenomena. The extent to which that knowledge economy spins off to the other parts of our city and to the other lower skilled sectors is in debate massively. The other thing in Australia is our low skilled people are located in our far-flung outer urban areas, and their ability to participate in the knowledge sectors is increasingly limited, highly bound by costs of transport and these sorts of things. We do need to put a picture of where inequality and poverty, not so much poverty, but wealth redistribution is occurring. Against that sort of social stratification in the labour market, property prices in the inner areas and middle ring suburbs of Australian cities have gone up 500% in comparison to 100% in the outer areas. So our assumptions about flexibility in labour markets, our ability for the labour force to move around, just in the last 12 years, forget about it. Where people buy, they will stay. So we certainly have a wealth level and a wealth redistribution part of the economy. That's why I think the housing researchers are moving to exclusion and disadvantage as distinct from poverty and inequality, which we started this off. And a window on that is our cities and the way in which our labour market in Australia is highly and increasingly constrained to move with the sorts of flexibility that we are undersitting a lot of our programs, underscoring a lot of our programs. That's a comment so far.
Reactions from the group, or should we?
If I could just make one reaction. While it's true over the past 30 years or so that inequalities increased within OECD countries, global inequality has actually gone way down. And I think it's one of the really good news things that's happening in the world that often we lose track of with our national focus. And it's a direct result of some of the things that are driving inequality within countries, which are increased free trade and increased returns to education. And I think as a global citizen, as a human being, I'm actually really happy about global trends in inequality. and without losing track of the trends within countries. So I just, every time people talk about inequality, I do like to bring that up. So,
just one point. I grew up in Elizabeth, which is in the northern suburbs of Adelaide. I guess my observation would be that I take your point about the kind of distribution of job opportunities and how they're spatially concentrated, the better ones in the centre of cities and so on. But I think the educational opportunities have probably got wider than when they were when I was growing up. I think I could go to a college of advanced education, maybe, at Elizabeth. But you've got the University of Western Sydney. We've got quite good dispersion of our vocational and university institutions across the cities, as well as within the centres of them.
I'll just comment on the mobility issue you were raising. I think that is a significant issue. What we find in the department, we've got measures in place to assist job seekers, particularly those who are disadvantaged, to move to other parts of Australia. They certainly don't move to Western Australia from east. They'll move up and down the east, but they won't go to Western Australia. There is an issue there. Fly in, fly out is having a positive and negative impact, but certainly it is addressing some of that issue. But I agree, there is work that needs to be done, and we're looking at all of those issues around the impediments to moving. The housing issue, the cost. We might provide $6,000 to move a job seeker to Western Australia, but if they can't afford to rent and they don't have any family or support or community, then they're going to be in trouble and they're not going to last there. So we do need to look at broader social responses to those issues, so people can move to where the jobs are and can be seen. Having said that, a lot of people do move, and they move regularly, but it's just it seems to be the distance factor and the rental issue and the other social supports issue that we haven't really come to terms with.
Jason, did you want to?
Yeah, just a quick point on inequality in cities. I think this is a terrific point. I mean, one of the fascinating currents in urban sociology and sociology generally is trying to understand what denationalization means for how we think about structures of inequality. Where inequality is, and I think that applies equally well to where labour markets are. I mean, those are highly placed as well. I mean, one of the striking things about Europe now is how highly regionalized the European labour market is, and even the European capital market and product markets are highly regionalized, and that's something that, because of the particular geography of Australia, is not quite as true, right, for this region. And so, I don't think we've necessarily thought through the implications of that. The other point that came to mind is the point about global inequality. We should compare notes because my understanding of the stylized facts of trends in global inequality is that really it depends on which kind of inequality are you looking at. Are you weighting each country equally? Are you weighting countries by population, or are you looking at individual level data aggregated to to global inequality? So.
Robert Antich, Department of Finance and Deregulation. I just had a question about Dan and your observations about flexible and nimble institutions in terms of dealing with the market. Can you point to some examples of what you think's worked and not worked in the European system, bearing in mind the cultural differences and those things? And I guess if Sandra has anything to add to that, that'd be quite interesting.
Shall I respond?
Yeah.
Yeah, in particular, it's the kind of transition of public employment services, in particular, from large bureaucracies that dealt with distribution of benefits towards kind of employment-focused job outcome generating kinds of machines. And I think those kind of trends are strongest in, say, countries like the UK and Germany, which have been through various kind of reform processes. And you see the contrast with other countries like Spain and Ireland, which have other kinds of issues going on in there. But one of them is the nature of the institutions and the nature of the ways their kind of public employment services haven't changed, or that have continued doing things that they used to do in the 1980s into the 2000s. And, you know, it's that kind of contrast that I was trying to point to. And equally, Australia itself has been in the forefront of some of those changes, and more radically than most has kind of contracted out its delivery system. And one of the things I've been very interested in is there was some speculation about how quickly and how agile that contracted out system would be when it started to face an economic shock. And contrary to the kind of perceptions of many people in Europe, it appears, and I wasn't here, I didn't see it kind of thing, but from the evidence, it actually responded very quickly and pretty well, you know. And so it's that kind of transition that I'm referring to.
Yep.
Peter.
I had a question for Mark to start off. Peter Whiteford, Crawford School. A question for Mark and then one for Dan, but the others could respond to it. I was really struck by your statistics of the people exiting the labour force with qualifications versus people coming in. But presumably at some stage that's going to have to equalise, you know, sort of that it'll reach some sort of steady state. Have you done any estimates of, when that would be? Or have we still got, sort of the positive effects of growing educational attainment? Is that going to sort of peak in 20 years' time or 30 years' time or 5 years' time? And I guess, presumably it would be possible to estimate it from looking at educational attainment at younger ages. And the question I had to Dan and others, if they wanted to respond, is that in Australia we have a very large and expensive system of family payments. But what's unusual is we don't distinguish between people outside the workforce and in paid work. They get the same amount. But it's very large. I mean, say for example, a minimum wage worker with 2 children could get $10,000 a year in family payments. But I was wondering whether we need to think about payments for people without children or tax credits for people without children. And I'm not sure whether some of the tax credits in the UK are for people without children, because there is, I think, a perception that the people without children are the ones who are paying for all these payments for people with children.
Okay, so handily. You've got a fellow called Robin Shreve coming here talking on a panel tomorrow, and his agency, the Australian Workforce and Productivity Agency, put out a report just over a week ago called Future Focus, and it speculates as to what the future might look like. It does so through the use of scenarios rather than any kind of baseline projection, and they have 4 different scenarios of what the future might look like, and they hired Deloitte Access Economics to under each of those scenarios look at what the composition of employment might look like across industries and occupations, and therefore what it might imply about the levels of educational attainment that might be required to meet those particular scenarios. And under 3 of them, under all of them, there is, under all of them, the results of this modelling exercise, and you can make various criticisms of it, but under all of them, the rate of qualification acquisition is faster than the rate of population growth, and it's consistently faster for higher level qualifications than it is for lower level qualifications. Will this reach some kind of natural balance? I'm not sure. There's Stephen Schwartz, former Vice-Chancellor, I think, of the University of Canberra, is writing various pieces at the moment saying we've already got it, and there's evidence of over-education, over-qualification, and we should start to see rates of return to education starting to decline. And there's a contested literature on that.
Just add a stat to that. I mean, at the moment we've got 30% of workers where they need a bachelor degree or higher. There was 23% in '87. Half of the employment growth over the past 5 years has been in occupations at that higher level, and only 7.4% of employment growth over the last 5 years has been in, Cert 1 or secondary school qualification level. So I don't think it's peaked yet.
Just how long you've got in terms of the positive impact?
In terms of the tax credit question,
Yes, yeah.
that was, to some extent, I mean, the way I read family tax benefit, and I may be completely mistaken, right? And this is what I think is my take on, our welfare systems do other things other than get people back into work. They're about poverty alleviation and about targeting support at that next future generation of people. And I would read family tax benefits through a UK set of eyes, which is these are payments directed at children and ensuring that that future generation gets fed and clothed in a way that they wouldn't without those kind of transfers taking place. The specific question about whether in the British situation, when we adapted the kind of EITC model and created the kind of working tax credits, after a few years we very much disaggregated what we call the working tax credit from child tax credits. Child tax credits are much more extensive, much more generous and things like that. But one of the features of the working tax credits were they were used fairly flexibly, and alongside people with children, the other groups that were eligible were older workers in their 50s and also people in low-paid work aged over 25. And interestingly, when we went into the recession and the consequence of the recession, one of the big increases was amongst those single people claiming a tax credit. So it acted almost as a stabiliser and kept those people in work rather than coming out into the kind of benefit system. Now, of course, we're shredding our tax credit system, but in the kind of classic recalibration, we're shredding it and taking it away from groups of people, but we are actually extending it to single people who are aged under 25, as long as they're very poor.
Okay, I want to try and shake things up a bit.
Bit of blood.
Bit of blood. Why not? It's that time of the afternoon. So I want to pick up a question Jason put on the table, and because this is where I think the American discussion is a bit, or a piece of it anyway, and so there are two important trends in America, I think, that are helping us understand what's going on in that labour market, and one is that income growth is no longer keeping pace with productivity growth, and the other is that deunionisation can explain about a third of the increase in private sector wage inequality. These sorts of findings are interpreted as evidence of a shift in the balance of power in the American labour market, away from workers and towards employers. And so the political economy of the labour market has changed, and in a way that's adverse to workers, and then we see particularly low-skilled workers, and then we see all these adverse outcomes for low-skilled workers. So the question is then, well, what's happening in Australia? Because the whole labour market is doing quite well, and I understand that low-skilled workers are not doing as well as highly skilled workers, but nevertheless their incomes are also increasing. So is the story that growth has been so strong that it's just overwhelmed the effects of politics in a way, and that's the answer. That's the answer to trends in the Australian labour market. And if that's the case, then my follow-up question is, and this is sort of this is a question I think Quinton's presentation raises. What happens when the growth slows? Are you ready? And or does the politics, the distributional politics, re-emerge, and then we get to see the true state of play, and then we'll sort of find out what's what. So does anyone want to take a stab at that?
Do you want to answer? I mean, in terms of the question of what's different about Australia, what happened differently for us? I suppose that people would be aware. I mean, the government did a whole range of things. I mean, we have different workplace relations arrangements. We have minimum wage. We have employment standards. We have, I guess what happened with the government in the GFC was the stimulus that occurred. We're very much exposed to Asia. We've got now a very strong mining sector, which has had significant impact on other industries and had, sort of flow-on effects to other industries. So everyone's aware of all of those things. We're in a strong position, have been in a strong position. We've got highly skilled workers. Mark talked about, the access of Australians to skills and to training and the fact that they're taking up those opportunities. In terms of the future, I mean, part of that goes to the fact that governments and businesses and economies, all of those need to work together to ensure we are flexible enough to be able to adjust, hence my focus on structural adjustment. Yeah. We need to be scanning that and seeing what it's going to look like and adjusting now. So for employment services, we're talking about 2015 and beyond now because we need to. I mean, countries like Singapore spend all their time talking about the future. What does it mean for the future? What are we looking like? We need to do the same. We can't be focused on everything's good now. We need to constantly think ahead. And I think Australia has done that. And the fact of contracting out our employment services is one way we've done that. But there's a whole range of other things. That's not to say it will continue, but those are some things that have worked so far.
Yeah.
But it's a big question that you've asked.
I know. A couple of observations. I mean, I guess the audience here is primarily Australian rather than US, but I don't think it. I mean, even though the nature of the award system's been deregulated and so on, the piece of theatre surrounding the annual federal minimum wage case and the way in which that's announced and percolates through the system is very different to what happens in the United States, and it kind of does set a floor on percentage increases, I think, in wages. But wage growth hasn't kept pace with productivity gains in Australia. It hasn't. I don't know exactly what the ratio is and how it compares with the US, but it hasn't been 100%. But we have had, and I gather you've heard this from Quinton earlier today, this experience of this kind of break in income growth versus growth in GDP as a result of the very big increase in the terms of trade. So people's incomes have been able to grow faster than wages, even though the wages didn't keep pace with productivity growth. So there has been some unique circumstances around that. I don't know. I mean, the preparation for the future question is a really interesting one. We are going to be hitting some headwinds because it is likely the terms of trade will ease off, or they already have, and we'll also start hitting demographic headwinds as well, with the baby boomer cohort moving into retirement, and that's going to pull down the participation rate unless there is a kind of positive effect on that by virtue of educational participation and so on. Yeah.
skills sort of adjustment through time. So with regards to our employment policies, it seems, at least from the outside, that our main focus is on getting people jobs as opposed to perhaps where that future jobs market might be. So when we're pushing people towards getting employment, are we also thinking about, well, where, you know, if we've got people in manufacturing, for example, are they just moving into other areas of manufacturing that are also in a declining sort of industry, and therefore it's not a sustainable view of where skills need to be built, and therefore are we setting ourselves up for to be in a good position for major structural reforms which might happen a lot more quickly than the kind of gradual declines in particular sectors. And I guess one of the issues in there is the balance between what we see as being personal responsibility for people's skills as opposed to, you know, individuals being human capital into our economy. So I'd welcome comments on that.
Look, on the are we getting people the right skills? A lot of work goes into that. Governments provide, you know, federal government, state governments provide. You know, they fund training that's in areas where there's going to be skill shortage. Their job is to try and forecast and predict and not keep churning out multiple hairdressers and other jobs where there's not going to be jobs. The job of my department is to do a lot of that forecasting, and we do a lot of work on where are the skills shortages likely to be, where are the growth areas likely to be. We talk to our employment services providers and say, you know, it's not sensible for you to be training people in areas that are not going to be the jobs of the future. So there's a whole lot of interaction going on there. So very focused on it. It's very important. It doesn't stop people continuing to get training in things they don't need. And we get, one of the criticisms of our remote areas was that a whole lot of Indigenous people had multiple qualifications, but they didn't have jobs. And this churning issue, putting people through course after course, and they've got a great CV, but they're not actually getting a job. One of the key reasons for the change was that kind of thing. So the remote jobs program will now be quite different. It will require them to actually have a community plan, a regional plan that says where are the jobs, we train in those areas, we fund in those areas. It'll be much more targeted. So there's still, I mean, it's not perfect, but that's certainly the intention, trying to get it right and think to the future. One of the things we're doing for 2015, the presentations we do, is to talk very much about what's the labour market going to look like in 2015 and beyond. What is Australia going to be like? Where are the jobs going to be? And then what, therefore, are the services we need to purchase? I think that conversation absolutely has to come first before you go out and purchase the type of service. I think that there was another question, but probably someone else to answer. But did you have a second question? I'm sorry. That was it. Sorry. Yeah.
There are two questions I want to pick up. This gentleman first, and then this question up here.
I am just wondering if there is any government initiative in US in the area of microfinancing to create new jobs.
Yes, but I don't know much about it. Do you know microcredit in...
Certainly in Asia.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is becoming a tool of American urban policy as well. I mean, it's an interesting case of sort of reverse policy learning from the development field. I've exhausted. I've just told you everything I know about that.
Are you talking about businesses?
Microcredit, yeah.
So, I mean, one of the things the government currently funds is projects for people to set up their own businesses. That sort of, in Australia, that certainly happens. So people can get, in lieu of having income support, they can get that same amount of money, but they're actually running a business. So it's to get them started into a business. So that's available now, and people do that now. It's like an income support offset, but it's into an actual job. Is that kind of the thing you were...
That is not that. There is now a very successful cases in some developing countries.
Yes, yes.
And as you know, non-traditional banking system, so it is very much appreciated by the disadvantaged groups. They have the ideas of creating jobs or doing business, but due to shortage of capital, they were in a great disadvantaged positions, and that is why, you know, microfinancing project came in the name of Grameen, and they are now replicated in most of the developing countries and sometime in European countries, and I heard that it is also replicated in US. That's why my interest to I wanted to know if there is any successful history or just story.
Finance people here might answer.
Anyway, thank you. What's your personal opinion in that case? How do you feel the importance of microcredit in Australia or in US? As an economist, how do you feel? Your reactions would be very much appreciated. It would be our lesson also.
I haven't got enough information on it. I know exactly what you're talking about and what other countries do in this area, but I'd have to, our finance people and treasury people would need to respond. I'm sorry, I don't know what the pros, cons for in the Australian context are. Does anyone want to comment?
But there are kind of, certainly in the UK and some of the European countries, there are examples of preferential lending, community kind of institutions and community banks lending to kind of low-income companies and enabling those to kind of start. And at its best, that kind of combines with some of the support systems and flexibilities that exist in income support systems, which will also facilitate and encourage people to establish their own businesses or to establish, you know, in those kind of areas, and those can be quite substantial. You know, the self-employment start-up programs in the United Kingdom targeted at unemployed people are now kind of providing kind of facilities, maybe 50, 60,000 people, some of whom will have access to various forms of microcredit to kind of help them. But I think that point about not reverse learning, but learning from development field is a really important one, because I think Australia has another kind of example which I'm very interested in, which is it's highly controversial here, which they call income management, but that's very much like the conditional cash transfers, which have developed in Latin America and very, very extensive in countries like Mexico through to Brazil, and have actually had significant impacts in terms of educational outcomes and health outcomes, and using income transfers to get a double effect. You know, you alleviate immediate poverty, but the requirement is that in alleviating that immediate poverty, you then ensure that people, young children go to school, young children get healthcare services, and that's something that's very kind of positive and one of those kind of reverse learnings that's taken place. Yeah.
I mean, in American urban policy, there have been many efforts to promote investment in areas of concentrated disadvantage, and they've not been wildly successful. And where they have increased employment, that employment hasn't always been drawn from the local communities in which investment is being promoted. So it seems that part of the story has to be the development of human capital in those neighbourhoods of concentrated poverty, that investment incentives by themselves haven't been hugely successful. I think another part of the story too, and so there's kind of something I'm thinking about as I listen to this discussion, have those efforts been large enough? Has there been enough political will in the US in those targeted anti-poverty efforts? Has there been enough political will to mount the kind of program that is equal to the task? And I think obvious, actually. And then question up here.
Stephen Long, economics correspondent at the ABC. I'm very glad that Jason raised the issue of power, because I feel like that's the elephant in the room that's been ignored, or at least tiptoed around most of the day. Why is the New Start allowance at a poverty level, despite the fact that it's manifestly inadequate, and the Business Council of Australia has joined forces with the welfare lobby in arguing it's bad policy that actually stops people becoming job ready? It's because the people on the New Start allowance are relatively powerless and not very popular either with the mainstream electorate. It just seems to me the issue of power pervades the whole inequality discussion. I'd also like to just make some observations from what I've heard and what I know about the differences between the countries. Mark Cully touched on it. One of the key differences between Australia and the United States in terms of the labour market, it seems to me, is that at a national level we've maintained a robust minimum wage structure. And that minimum wage structure, much derided by many economists, has put a floor under the entire labour market, which might mean that people complain about prices being high here, but it's actually had an impact on the difference in Australia in terms of that we actually have a relatively decent wages system here. We re-regulated the labour market and shifted the balance in favour of employers, shifted more risk to workers, but we didn't do it nearly as much as the United States. In the United States, middle class incomes have been smashed, people below median incomes, well, falling in real terms. And what happens? You get the global financial crisis in part because those incomes couldn't sustain perpetually rising consumption, which became absurdly debt-fuelled, and creditworthy was redefined. So that's one of the key institutional differences. And the other one is just luck, that we happen to be a resources-rich country at the foot of Asia that's had a massive boost to aggregate demand. It would seem to me that there are key differences, but power pervades all of this, and unless we actually tackle the issue of entrenched inequality, class inequality, inequalities of power, then we're still going to be talking about the same issues however long hence. More of an observation than a question.
No, it's a great observation on which to close, actually, because our time has come. And so what I would like to do, I think I'm trying to weigh, why don't we take a quick word in the shadow of that comment from each of our panellists by way of conclusion. So we'll start with you, Bob, and we'll, if you want to.
I'll pass, actually.
And
Very good.
I'll pass too. Thanks.
Oh, this will be quick. Sandra.
Oh, look, I would. Your question is a powerful question. It's a very difficult one. I mentioned before about that balance issue is always really difficult. Payments and structures, income support versus job incentives versus support. A whole range of things have been. There have been significant changes in Australia. There will continue to be. My view as a policy person is that we have been ahead and responsive in a whole range of ways, but it's that difficulty of getting the income support right to encourage people to move off to work quite quickly. And many of the people on New Start are working. Many of them already have jobs, and it's trying to get that right so that they will get full-time jobs, obviously. And then there's this part about supporting them, but also having the carrot. It's the carrot and the stick balance, I guess, is put it crudely. I mean, our remote services, for example, the communities out there said to us, we want people to be forced to do things. It is not acceptable to have people in remote communities sitting around and not doing anything for their income support. They need to be doing activities. Alcoholism, violence against women have increased. the government needs to intervene, so the government increased compliance, is increasing job seeker compliance in those areas. Now, some people would see that as a power issue, others would see it as a necessity. So I guess it depends where you're coming from, and governments always have a difficult job to do in trying to get that balance right and to meet all the stakeholder needs. So I can't answer your question apart from to say it's an ongoing question.